Welcome, and thank you all for taking the time to watch this recorded training session. I'm Sophie Cabot, the Community Archivist for the Community Archives Skills Support and Sustainability Project, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. This session is a forum to think about types of volunteer and their motivations, how to recruit volunteers, new sources that you might not have considered, how to make the most of your volunteers, how to make sure your volunteers get the most out of it, cycles of renewal in volunteering, and recognition and reward for volunteers. So, volunteering, what is it and what isn't it? It might be surprising to start with such a basic question. We all know what volunteering is, don't we? In fact, it's important before recruiting to think about what volunteering actually is in law and what it's not. Not all unpaid work is volunteering. Volunteering needs to meet one of two legal tests. It's either in line with the first bullet point, which is technically called voluntary work, in that it can be just like a job, but the people you're doing it for meet a number of criteria around working for the public good, or it meets the second definition, volunteering, in that it's extremely unstructured and more like helping out. From our point of view as community archives, the roles around helping to run an organisation or its projects are likely to be voluntary work, whereas people helping with events and so on are more likely to be volunteering. Ordinary group membership or doing your own research are leisure activities and not either kind of volunteering. This doesn't really matter day to day, except for in a few special cases which you need to know about. Firstly, you cannot allow someone to volunteer in a structured role for a commercial organisation. Doing this would contravene the National Minimum Wage Act 1998, as amended 2021. For instance, if a retired worker agrees to manage the archives of a business, that must not become a structured role. Otherwise, the person should be being paid by the business and paying any tax due on their earnings. Secondly, people in certain legal situations may have limits on how much volunteering they can do. If they're in receipt of certain benefits, or if they're a person with no recourse to public funds, people in those positions might actually have a lot of time on their hands and be looking for meaningful activity, but before giving them a role, it's important that you or they check with a welfare rights advisor that they have no limits on what they can do. Both of you could potentially face penalties if you get this wrong. It's also worth noting that welfare rights advice is regulated and you can't provide it unless you're qualified. So if in doubt, refer to a suitable organisation like the CBA. What about membership? Membership used to be the dominant model for community heritage groups like archives. The advantage of membership is that it provides a base income for your group and a contacts database, and it's often a historic reality. If your archive group is a membership organisation in this way, your group members may not think of themselves as volunteers, and being members has some advantages. Membership creates a sense of identity and social cohesion, but these activities would be classed as leisure activities. So how useful the concept is depends on what sort of project your group does. Thinking of your members' activities as volunteering really comes into its own for either group management, so roles like the chairman and treasurer, members of committees, projects, meaning a limited time effort on a specific subject, something like cataloguing your archive, putting together a publication, or deciding to research a particular family or business, or events, so that's exhibitions, festivals and history fairs, either those you run for yourself or your contribution to a wider programme like Heritage Open Days or Norfolk Day. Talking in terms of volunteering may also offer a way into your group for people who can't see themselves as traditional members, maybe because they don't identify with the profile of your existing membership. The pillars of volunteering in the UK have always been women in later middle age. That's statistically true and has been for decades, and it will probably remain so. But as people's careers get longer, their incomes are more stretched and families get more complicated, the supply of these people is dwindling. It's important, therefore, to develop a good understanding of what reasons people might have to volunteer, whether they are yet aware of them or not, so that you can create opportunities and experiences that fulfill the needs of the volunteer and attract the right people. You can identify a number of types of volunteer based on common characteristics. The most common are listed on the slides. So traditional volunteers, passion-led volunteers, and well-being-based volunteers, career development volunteers, and work skills-based. They fall into two broad categories. So those types in blue on the slide are development-focused volunteers. These are people who need to get something back out of volunteering for their own personal future, be it educationally, for work experience, or to develop their skills. Whereas experiential volunteers, in red on the slide, literally means people who are in it for the experience. So that covers those who care more about the volunteering itself than any plan for their own futures, including people who are volunteering for well-being reasons, ones led by a passion for the subject. It's very important to recognise that this is not better or more noble. Both kinds of volunteering are also intrinsically altruistic. Just so we understand the terms we're using, neurodivergence on this slide includes a range of differences people experience in their sensory and social processing, and includes things like autism and ADHD. So this might be your idea of a group of traditional volunteers, but of course, even within this group of women, there will be diverse motivations and needs. What do the different kinds of volunteer need? Everybody needs a mixture of things back from volunteering. It's a complex web of rewards. This diagram shows you what each type of volunteer might primarily need back from the experience with you in order for it to be fulfilling and for them to carry on with it. Traditional volunteers need intellectual stimulation, purposeful activity, human contact, and to make a contribution to a cause. Career development volunteers need training and to develop skills and confidence. Work skills volunteers need the same things, but often also a purposeful activity which is work-like and prepares them for working life. Well-being-based volunteers might primarily need the same purpose, but with more emphasis on intellectual stimulation, human contact and confidence, and the feeling of being part of a cause. And finally, those led by a passion for a subject mostly want to make that contribution, but they also need the communication and contact we all do, and to feel intellectually stimulated. They will often progress to be your advocates and trainers for the future. Expressed in another way, looking at motivations rather than needs, every volunteer is motivated by a number of things, but ideally you want to reach as many motivations for each person as possible. This will not just give them the most rewarding experience, but will result in retention, commitment, and good advocacy for your organisation. Of course, in a perfect world, each volunteering experience would fulfil every need. But in the real world, it's fine and much more likely for you to be able to meet a couple of needs for each volunteer whilst meeting your own requirements as well. The first exercise in this training is for members of community groups, and is about establishing a baseline of knowledge about your current volunteering programme. You need to do this before you can usefully think about diversifying your volunteers or recruiting to fill gaps you might have. If you don't currently have a volunteer cohort, please skip this section. If you're doing the exercise, have a conversation with your group and make some notes about what you know and don't know about your current volunteers. How do you collect that information now? Is it reliable? Then have a brief discussion of how you could establish a baseline without either excessive intrusive questioning or making assumptions about people. Recruitment. Getting new and different volunteers is the main issue volunteer groups raise. So in this next session, we will look at some ideas to try and access new sources. Identifying your needs will be the starting point for many groups. There's a skills gap in your organisation and probably a general feeling about what kind of person might meet it. But there might also be a general feeling that it will be difficult or even impossible to fill that gap. The way to address this is to be systematic. We suggest that you audit your skills, then your tasks, and establish your skills gap. The way to do that might be through a formal survey exercise for a large organisation, or just a conversation for a small one. From an understanding of your skills gap, you can move on to identifying roles you would like to fill and working out how to make them attractive to the right person. When you're thinking about voluntary work, that is the more structured kind of volunteering, our experience is that everyone is helped if you actually make the process quite formal. This might seem counterintuitive in that it might look intimidating, but in fact it has the opposite effect. A role description can help set clear expectations and make everyone feel more comfortable. There are some typical roles on this slide, but you also might have very specialised or specific ones for your organisation. There's also a link here to what an NRO volunteer role description looks like. Having developed role descriptions, you then want to advertise them. There are a whole range of local and national resources for advertising for volunteers, some of which are listed on the slide. An important thing to remember is that advertisements need to be recent and current to generate interest. You can't just put up a general advertisement and leave it there for years and years, so schedule time and regularly refresh your appeals. New sources of volunteers. Job seekers have specific needs around volunteering, and here I'm not so much talking about anyone who might be looking for a job, but more about people experiencing long-term unemployment or barriers to getting into work or back into work. Many people in this position principally lack workplace confidence, but others lack IT skills now considered essential, or functional literacy at an office-ready level. Volunteering can allow people to develop all of these skills in a supportive environment whilst they're making a useful contribution. To contact people in this position, you need to work with those who support them. Contact them through unemployment support schemes or just by tailoring your advertisements. Libraries and local authorities are often the people supporting job seekers. Be aware that job seekers may have to leave you at short notice if they're offered work. This isn't their fault and it isn't a significant problem. Training, be it formal or informal, is also very important to job seekers. You need to offer identifiable workplace skills and think about how and when you're going to be prepared to offer references, as well as being clear about that. Working with students. I have a lot of experience of working with student volunteers and more formally with student interns. Just as a side note, internships, if they're unpaid, are only suitable for registered charities and public bodies, but they can be a useful model for intensive project-based volunteering for those organisations. Otherwise, students are something of a wasted resource in volunteering, especially where you have reasonable access to an HE or FE campus, which we do in most parts of Norfolk. Many institutions have a professional service in place to help with recruiting and supporting student volunteers and may have recognition or accreditation to motivate their students. In our area, UEA, NUA, City College and the College of West Anglia, as well as Eastern College, all have formal support structures for student volunteering. Other institutions in other places may as well. If not, individual tutors are usually supportive. One quick additional note is that this advice is focused on volunteers from further and higher education who are adults. Working with minors, i.e. people under 18, is a bit different and requires a certain skill set. That can also be very rewarding for you and for them, but if your organisation is not otherwise set up to safeguard young people, you would need to put safeguarding processes in place, including training, and staff directly supervising those young people would need to go through a DBS disclosure process. This is free for volunteers, but it needs to be undertaken through a suitable umbrella body, which can have charges. You should also bear this in mind if you're approached to provide school work experience. There's an annual rhythm to student or academic life, and it helps to work with it and not against it. The off-season for student volunteering might be the high season for your organisation, however, so you need to plan tasks accordingly. There can also be practical issues to overcome with students that tend not to arise with older volunteers. They may not have their own transport, and because they're often incomers to the area or haven't lived independently for very long, you may be surprised by how difficult they find getting to your location or work address. You need to find creative ways to overcome this, but it can be done. Sometimes your existing volunteers may be dismissive of, or at least not supportive of, working with students. Or, alternatively, they might have unrealistic expectations and think students are the answer to everything. So you may need to manage expectations and attitudes. Another recruitment idea is micro-volunteering. Sometimes the kind of volunteering you offer can be tailored to encourage different people to get involved. Micro-volunteering can be much less structured, without much paperwork. You don't need role descriptions or application forms for this, and it can cover two slightly different kinds of volunteering tasks. One are practical but occasional tasks, so things like spring cleans or repaints, or moving things. And another is taster activities, so those are small projects designed to introduce your work, perhaps over a day or a weekend. Both are very good for people who are not looking to commit to long-term volunteering. You can often access highly skilled working-age people in this way, either by creating family or individual leisure opportunities, or sometimes by working with employers. Pro bono and corporate volunteering is another way you can work with professionals. It's slightly different. In pro bono work, somebody provides you with a service that they would normally charge for, but waives their fee. In corporate volunteering, you work with an employer specifically. The key differences between the two are set out in this slide. Most people have heard of lawyers doing pro bono work, but all chartered professionals will consider it. Architects, quantity surveyors, and structural engineers, for instance, if you're doing a building project. But if you're approaching these people, be clear at the outset that you are looking for a pro bono contribution. With corporate volunteering, you need a hook. Often the hook is to work with a large employer who's based in your community, but it might be around an issue or a cause, or it might even be where a company needs to reduce reputational damage. Just be wary of the last one. Anyone you recruit for a job or as a volunteer needs to know what's expected of them and to provide you with at least the minimum information you need to keep them safe and communicate with them. So to do this, you should aim for some kind of formal agreement, but that should be commensurate in scale with the volunteering they're doing. From a tick box or an email reply for small volunteering, right up to an application form and an appointment process for structured roles. To develop the documents you need, firstly, you should develop a volunteering policy. This might seem like overkill, but it has a similar function to the role descriptions in that it creates clarity. It can be quite a short document or more involved, depending on the scale of your operations. One of the opportunities created by writing a policy is to think about diversity and widening participation. This is where you set out how you will make volunteering accessible to all and what you will do to remove barriers to volunteering. This might include practical measures like paying for travel, or an assertion of your values and expected behaviours like using inclusive language. You might want to look back at your baselining exercise to see if there are groups who appear to be excluded from your volunteering now and think about what their barriers might be. Here are some examples of policies on different scales and also links to guidance on best practice from two respected volunteering organisations. Whichever recruitment method you use, it's important to know who you've recruited. It can be useful to record standardized information, and this allows you to collect essential contact and medical information in a controlled way, which is compliant with data protection legislation. This is better than just saving your volunteers' details in your email or an address book. but you do have to keep this information secure and be clear about who has access to it. You will need to research a suitable privacy statement and data control arrangements based on who you are and what information you're recording. Good advice can be found online, for instance, at resourcecentre.org.uk. Retention.
If you find you are losing volunteers, it's worth thinking about why. Firstly, sometimes it's just normal for people to move on. Most people won't stay in the same voluntary role for life, and that's no bad thing. It might be a readjustment, but regular replacement can refresh your team and bring in new ideas. It's only a problem if you think people are leaving when they'd rather not, or because they are unsatisfied. In the section on recruitment, we talked about the importance of clear expectations on both sides, managed by role or project descriptions. But you can take this further by having a schedule of volunteering reviews. These could be one-to-one meetings, or occasional group meetings, or even conducted by email, but it's a useful process to have in place. Here are a few frequent answers that you might encounter, and some ideas for addressing them. It used to be common for volunteers to remain with an organisation for years, even decades. This still happens, of course, but it's also increasingly common for volunteers to come in and out of organisations more frequently. Accepting this actually helps to accommodate new and more diverse sources of volunteers. These comings and goings can be driven by various things: working on cyclical events, for instance a seasonal programme; project-based working, where the timescale is set at the outset; student life, which has its own annual rhythm and course length restrictions; family life, the need to care for children or grandchildren in the summer holidays, for instance; changes of the season. More people want to volunteer in January and in spring. Fewer people do so in high summer and in cold, wet weather. Treating all volunteering as project-based, even if it's a recurring project, can be a good way of addressing this. This example is drawn from the experience of successfully diversifying the volunteers working on Norfolk Heritage Open Days. The timetable is a challenging one. It's hard for students because the work takes place just before the start of the academic year, so this means asking people to come back early to do it. For families, it's just after the holiday period, so it's a difficult time to ask people to do training. The answer is to recruit in April or May, collecting information and commitments, do some initial training in June, before the holidays, and then backup training in the weeks before the event. A compulsory get-together or briefing at the start of the festival period brings the whole cohort together. After the festival, a social occasion with reward and celebration, and the opportunity to express interest for next year, restarts the rhythm. There is then a quiet period from October to March, in which other development work can go on. The second exercise is for you to consider this project-based approach and how it might relate to the work your group does. Again, this exercise is for members of community groups, so if you feel this exercise is not relevant to you, please skip this section. Suggest some parts of your work which could be envisaged as discrete projects. Think a bit about low periods for you throughout the year, and whether they actually represent time that everyone needs to recover and plan, or whether they need to be filled up with additional projects. Reward. Volunteers do it for nothing, right? First, it's important to note that rewarding volunteers isn't about money. You have to be very careful providing material rewards to volunteers. Anything with a financial or equivalent value could be considered pay by HMRC and get both parties into trouble. It's possible to pay any genuine expense a volunteer incurs, but it must be on a real value basis, not a per diem or a flat rate. Volunteer expenses can actually be very important, because they remove a barrier to participation. But that's not what we're talking about here. This section is rather about what you can do to give back something which is rewarding in a social and personal sense, rather than an economic one. That could be through things that are useful to a development-driven volunteer, such as skills and qualifications, or things which enhance the social reward of volunteering for an experiential volunteer, or, as usual, a blend of the two. As we have discussed, you should always ask people what they hope to get out of volunteering during their recruitment phase. This will help, but people can't always articulate their needs, and some of the needs they articulate may be unrealistic. It's important, therefore, to start with an idea of what certain types of volunteer might need and how you could help them achieve it. Development-focused volunteers need ways to demonstrate their learning and experience. That could be a formal system, of which more soon, or just your willingness to write references. They should be encouraged to keep a diary, notebook, or blog, something to record the specifics of what they have learned or been trained to do, and to compose narratives of their experience. If they ask for guidance in doing this, encourage them to think in terms of CARL, context, where was I based, action, what did I do there, result, what happened or changed, and learning, what did I learn from that. All of this is good for their professional profile, CV, and future applications. Experiential volunteers don't usually need this level of record, although they might enjoy the validation of their learning. More tangible rewards for development-based volunteers come from the training you're able to offer them, be it internal or external. Qualification and certificates are different things. The first are much more involved than the second and have to be from a suitable, valid awarding body. But for development-focused volunteers, they can be much more valuable. References are important because they are the proof of people's time spent with you. There are several kinds. Simple references, just a note of dates and role title. This is usually what you do if you don't want to actively recommend the volunteer. Specific reference for a job or course. This is addressed to someone and goes into detail. General, to whom it may concern references, are for people who have not yet found the opportunity they want to apply for. An option in Norfolk, the Norfolk Volunteer Passport, is provided by Norfolk Adult Learning and Voluntary Norfolk. It's suitable for a wide variety of general volunteering, but there are also specific passports for heritage, and if you are a larger organisation, you might consider developing one of your own. If this idea is of interest, options to look at for inspiration include the Imperial War Museum scheme and the BAJR Archaeological Skills Passport. Don't underestimate the importance of public recognition of your volunteers. Experiential volunteers, especially, will not usually ask for a reward, but by celebrating their work collectively, rather than individually, you can create an atmosphere in which they feel valued. The slide features some examples of how you might do this. This kind of celebration also offers excellent opportunities for publicity, and so for future recruitment. And if you're working on a project-based system, you can also use these events as part of project evaluation. Some more examples to inform a reward include making sure that people feel in control of their volunteering and that they feel trusted with an appropriate degree of responsibility. There are lots of ways to go about this, but here are some examples. This is a checklist of what we have covered over the course of this session. How to create a baseline to understand your current volunteers, how to identify your volunteering needs, how to seek out new kinds of volunteers who might meet those needs, gain an understanding of what their needs and motivations might be and how you can meet them, and simple ways of improving your volunteer management practices. Here are some links to further information about different aspects of volunteering. And here are some further resources that will come in handy, including the Community Archives Toolkit, a reference guide to different aspects of managing an archive. You can also join the Norfolk Archives Network Forum, an online message board for community archives groups. Thank you for watching.